Officer, I am Special Agent Thorne with the FBI. You are making a serious mistake.
An FBI agent? Right, I've heard that one before. Step out of the car. Now.
Your order is not lawful, officer. I am not exiting the vehicle.
Have it your way.
The Maryland sun was high and unforgiving, baking the asphalt of the two-lane country road until heat shimmered above it like a phantom river. It was the kind of Tuesday afternoon that felt slow, forgotten by the rest of the world. Inside his air-conditioned patrol car, Officer Dale Hogan felt the familiar stir of boredom giving way to irritation. For 3 hours, he'd seen nothing but farm trucks and sedans driven by senior citizens. At 34, Hogan felt his career was as stagnant as the humid summer air. He'd been passed over for promotion twice, and a quiet bitterness had taken root, one that manifested as an overzealous application of his authority on these lonely back roads. He saw himself not as a peacekeeper, but as a guardian of a line only he could see, and anyone who crossed it deserved what was coming. Then he saw it. A black Dodge Charger, sleek and powerful, moving with a confident speed that Hogan instantly interpreted as arrogance. It wasn't breaking the speed limit, not technically, but it looked fast. More importantly, its windows were tinted, dark, and inscrutable. For Hogan, that was enough. It was the pretext he needed to break the monotony. Flipping on his lights, the sudden flash of red and blue felt like a surge of adrenaline. The Charger complied immediately, pulling onto the gravel shoulder with a smoothness that, for some reason, annoyed Hogan even more. He took a moment running the plates. Registered to a private owner, clean record. No matter, the tint was his hook. He swaggered as he left his vehicle, one hand resting casually on his service weapon. The sun glinted off his aviator sunglasses, hiding his eyes and giving him the detached, intimidating look he'd practiced in the mirror. He tapped on the driver's side window with a heavy knuckle. The window glided down silently, revealing a man in his late 40s, dressed in a simple polo shirt. The man's hands were already on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position. His expression was calm, neutral. "Good afternoon, officer," the man said, his voice even. "Is there a problem?" "License and registration," Hogan clipped, ignoring the question. His flashlight was already in hand, and he shone it directly into the man's face, a deliberate act of disorientation. The driver didn't even flinch. "And I'm going to need to see some paperwork on this window tint. It's well over the legal limit for Maryland." The man, whose name Hogan would soon learn was Marcus Thorne, kept his hands exactly where they were. "Officer, my license and registration are in the center console. I'm going to reach for them now. My hands will be in plain sight the entire time." The methodical announcement, the sheer professionalism of it, was like a spark on dry tinder for Hogan. Cops talked like that, or people who watched too many cop shows. "Just get the documents," Hogan snapped. Thorne moved with deliberate slowness, retrieving a wallet and the vehicle's registration. He handed them out the window. Hogan glanced at the license. Marcus Thorne. He looked at the registration. Clean. Then he focused back on the tint. "Like I said, these windows are illegal. That's a citation, possibly a mandatory fix-it order." "Officer, I can assure you they are not," Thorne said, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "This is a government vehicle, and I am a federal law enforcement officer on official business. As such, this vehicle is exempt from state tint regulations under federal statute." He paused, letting the words sink in. "My credentials are in my right pocket. With your permission, I can show them to you." For Hogan, this was the moment everything tilted. A federal agent? Out here? In this car? The claim was so audacious, so out of place, that he didn't just doubt it, he was insulted by it. It was a lie, a desperate, pathetic attempt by some suit to get out of a ticket. A dry, sharp laugh escaped Hogan's lips. "A federal agent? Buddy, I've heard it all. Everyone's a cop or a diplomat when they get pulled over. You think I was born yesterday?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I don't appreciate being lied to. It shows a lack of respect. Now I'm going to ask you one more time to step out of the vehicle." The sun beat down, the only sound the hum of the car's engine and the distant buzz of insects. The air was thick with unspoken challenge. Thorne didn't move. He simply looked at Hogan, his gaze steady. The stop was no longer about window tint. It was about authority, and Dale Hogan was convinced it was his. If you believe every officer should be trained to de-escalate, not dominate, hit that subscribe button. This channel is for you. Hogan's entire demeanor shifted. The practiced professionalism fell away, replaced by the raw ego of a man who felt his power being questioned. He saw Thorne's calm as defiance, his explanation as a lie, and his refusal to be intimidated as a personal insult. "Step out of the car now," he repeated, his voice rising. This wasn't a request. It was a command backed by the full weight of the badge on his chest, a weight he was now using as a hammer. The question wasn't if this situation would escalate. The question was how violently and how fast. The answer would come in a matter of seconds. Marcus Thorne's mind operated on two distinct levels. The first level was that of a citizen being illegally ordered by a police officer. The second, more dominant level, was that of a 20-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, an agent who had spent a decade teaching constitutional law and arrest procedures at Quantico. He knew with absolute certainty that Hogan's order was baseless. There was no reasonable suspicion of any crime beyond the fabricated tint violation. Ordering him out of the car was an illegal escalation, a fishing expedition for compliance or a reason to use force. Complying would validate the officer's illegal command. Resisting would be twisted into a narrative of obstruction. He chose a third option, clarification backed by federal authority. "Officer Hogan," Thorne said, reading the name from the officer's badge, his voice remaining level, a deliberate counterpoint to Hogan's rising anger. "I am not lying to you. I am Special Agent Marcus Thorne, FBI, Baltimore Field Office. My badge and credentials are in my pocket. All you have to do is make one call to dispatch and ask them to contact the field office. They will verify my identity and the status of this vehicle in under 2 minutes. You are making a mistake." He was offering a way out, a chance for Hogan to de-escalate without losing face. It was a lifeline. Hogan saw it as a slap in the face. This man wasn't just lying, he was doubling down, condescending to him, telling him how to do his job. The arrogance was staggering. "I'm done with your stories," Hogan spat, his hand moving from his gun to his taser. The yellow handle was a bright splash of color against his dark uniform. "I gave you a lawful order. You are obstructing my investigation. Get out of the car or I will remove you." Thorne recognized the shift instantly. The verbal threats, the hand on the taser. This was posturing transitioning into physical assault. He was trapped. The steering wheel was in front of him, the door to his left, the center console to his right. Any movement could be misconstrued as reaching for a weapon. He had to remain still, a statue of compliance, even while verbally refusing an illegal order. "Your order is not lawful, officer," Thorne stated, not as an argument, but as a point of fact for the record he knew was being created. "You have no probable cause to remove me from this vehicle." That was it, the final word. The calm, legalistic refusal broke the last thread of Hogan's self-control. For him, the law was not a set of principles. It was a tool he wielded. To have it used against him by this smug driver was an intolerable offense. He didn't see a federal agent. He saw a challenge that needed to be put down. "Fine," Hogan snarled, his face contorted with rage. "Have it your way." With a fluid motion, he drew his taser, aimed it through the open window, and pulled the trigger. There was no final warning. No taser, 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 as protocol dictated. Just the sharp, ugly crackle of electricity splitting the air. The two probes, trailing thin copper wires, struck Thorne in the chest and abdomen. 50,000 volts hijacked his central nervous system. His world dissolved into a firestorm of pure, white-hot agony. Every muscle in his body seized in a violent, uncontrollable contraction. His back arched, slamming him against the driver's seat. His hands, which had been resting peacefully on the wheel, clenched into rigid claws. A guttural cry was ripped from his lungs, a sound of pure shock and pain. He couldn't think. He couldn't move. He was a prisoner in his own body, and Dale Hogan was the warden. The 5-second cycle felt like an eternity. Through the blinding pain, Thorne's training fought for control. This is an assault. Document everything. He registered the smug, triumphant look on Hogan's face, a face now framed by the open car window. He registered the 2 dashboard cameras in Hogan's patrol car, the one on Hogan's own chest, and his own vehicle's incident recorder, which was always active. 4 cameras. 4 silent digital witnesses. Hogan believed he was asserting dominance. In reality, he was meticulously documenting his own felony. The taser cycle ended and Thorne's body slumped forward, his muscles twitching and unresponsive. He gasped for air, his heart hammering against his ribs. The acrid smell of ozone filled the car. Hogan wasn't finished. "I told you to get out of the car!" he screamed, his voice high and theatrical, a performance for his body camera. He was already building his false narrative. "Suspect is non-compliant, refusing lawful orders." He leaned in, the taser still aimed at Thorne's chest. "You want another one?" Do you think this was about law enforcement, or was it a pure abuse of power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The act itself was a crime, but the words spoken in its aftermath were the confession. Hogan wasn't a peace officer maintaining order, he was a street corner bully who had just found a new way to throw a punch, and he was proud of it. For a few moments, the only sounds were Thorne's ragged gasps for breath and the crackle of Hogan's police radio. The intense pain had subsided into a deep, full-body ache, and a disorienting fog clouded Thorne's thoughts. He tried to speak, to assert his identity again, but his jaw felt locked and his tongue was thick and useless. He was completely vulnerable, incapacitated in the driver's seat of his own vehicle. Officer Hogan, meanwhile, was already on his radio, his voice a caricature of official calm, a stark contrast to the rage of a few moments ago. "Dispatch, this is 3 Adam 40. Show me on a traffic stop, Route 113. I have 1 non-compliant male in custody, deployed taser. Scene is secure, but request backup for transport." In custody. The words were a fabrication. Thorne wasn't in custody, he was the victim of an assault. Non-compliant. Another lie, directly contradicted by the 4 video angles that had captured his professional demeanor. Hogan was creating his official record, a fiction designed to protect him from the crime he had just committed. He was banking on the idea that his report, his word as an officer, would outweigh the truth. Within 6 minutes, the wail of a siren grew louder, and a second patrol car pulled up behind Hogan's. The officer who emerged was older, with sergeant's stripes on his sleeves and a weary, seen-it-all expression on his face. This was Sergeant Eva Rostova, a 25-year veteran of the force who had seen rookies like Hogan rise and, all too often, fall. She approached the scene with a cautious, methodical gait, her eyes taking in everything. Hogan's rigid, defensive posture, the black charger, the wires of the taser leading through the open window. "Dale, what have you got?" Rostova asked, her voice calm and professional. "Dispatch said you tased him. What was the threat?" Hogan puffed out his chest, the hero of his own story. "Sergeant, suspect refused to exit the vehicle after multiple lawful commands, became belligerent, claimed to be some kind of fed to get out of a window tint ticket. I had to deploy the taser to gain compliance." The lies came easily, smoothly. He had probably told similar ones before. Rostova's gaze shifted from Hogan to the man in the driver's seat. Thorne had recovered enough to lift his head. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, but his eyes were clear and focused. They locked onto Rostova's. "Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice hoarse but steady. "My name is Special Agent Marcus Thorne, Federal Bureau of Investigation. My credentials are in my right pants pocket. This officer assaulted me after I refused an unlawful order." The directness of the statement, the lack of fear or anger, gave Rostova pause. This didn't sound like a belligerent suspect. It sounded like a professional stating facts. She looked back at Hogan, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "He's lying, Sarge," Hogan insisted, a little too quickly. "Just some suit trying to pull a fast one." Rostova ignored him. Her training and, more importantly, her instincts told her something was wrong. You don't get to be a sergeant for 15 years without developing a finely tuned sense for when a story doesn't add up. She addressed Thorne directly. "Sir, I'm going to have you step out of the vehicle now, very slowly. We need to get you checked out by medics and sort this out." Thorne nodded, using the steering wheel to pull himself up. Every muscle screamed in protest. As he slowly swung his legs out of the car and stood, something fell from his lap onto the floor mat. It was his wallet, which he'd placed there after Hogan had handed it back. It had fallen open. Rostova's eyes were drawn to it. Lying open on the black floor mat was not a Maryland driver's license, but a set of credentials. The leather case was flipped open, and even from a few feet away, the golden FBI badge was unmistakable. It caught the afternoon sun, gleaming with an authority that was absolute. Next to it, the photo identification card showed Marcus Thorne's face, clear as day, under the official seal of the Department of Justice. The proof had been there all along. A heavy silence fell over the scene. Hogan, who had been moving forward to handcuff Thorne, froze. He followed Rostova's gaze down to the floor of the car. He saw the badge. He saw the ID. All the blood drained from his face. The aggressive posture, the self-righteous anger, the swagger, it all vanished in an instant, replaced by a slack-jawed, ashen look of pure panic. The transformation was breathtaking. One moment he was the enforcer of the law. The next, he was a man who had just committed a violent felony against a federal agent. Rostova slowly bent down and picked up the credentials, examining them as if they were a holy relic. She looked up at Hogan, her expression grim. "Dale," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "What in God's name did you do?" The inversion of power was as swift as it was brutal. The air, once charged with Dale Hogan's manufactured authority, now crackled with a new, far more potent energy. Sergeant Rostova held the FBI credentials in her hand, the weight of them feeling heavier than a block of lead. She looked from the irrefutable proof of Thorne's identity to the pale, panicked face of her junior officer. The carefully constructed world Hogan had built around his actions, the non-compliant suspect, the lawful orders, the threat, had just been demolished by a small piece of leather and gold. "Get on the radio, Dale," Rostova ordered, her voice sharp, cutting through his stunned silence. "Right now, advise dispatch we have an agent-involved incident. You need to request the shift lieutenant and notify the nearest FBI field office. Immediately." The words agent-involved incident were a specific, dreaded code. It signified a catastrophic event, a red line crossed, immediately elevating the situation from a local police matter to a federal investigation. Hogan fumbled for his radio, his hands trembling. The confident voice he had used just minutes ago was gone, replaced by a stammering, breathless whisper as he relayed the message. Every officer listening on that channel would have felt a collective jolt. Thorne, meanwhile, leaned against the side of his car, his body still recovering from the electrical assault, but his mind sharp and clear. He was no longer the subject of a traffic stop. He was now the lead victim and primary witness in a federal crime. He watched as Hogan disintegrated, as the bully who had hidden behind a badge was exposed as a frightened man who had just destroyed his own life. "Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice gaining strength, "I want that officer's body camera secured as evidence immediately. I want my vehicle's data recorder preserved. I want this entire scene locked down. This is now a federal crime scene." Rostova nodded, her face set like stone. "Understood, Agent Thorne." She looked at Hogan, who was now leaning against his patrol car, looking like he might be sick. "Hogan, unholster your weapon and place it on the hood of your car. Then give me your body camera." It wasn't a request. Hogan complied numbly, his movements robotic. He unclipped the small black camera from his chest and handed it to her. That small device, which he believed was his shield, had become the prosecution's single most valuable piece of evidence. Rostova carefully placed it in an evidence bag she retrieved from her trunk. The chain of custody had begun. Within 15 minutes, the quiet country road looked like a major incident command post. The shift lieutenant arrived first, his face a mask of grim disbelief. He was followed by 2 more county sheriff's units. But then, a new set of vehicles arrived. Dark, unmarked sedans that drove with an unhurried purpose. The men who stepped out wore suits, not uniforms. They moved with a quiet efficiency that was both intimidating and deeply professional. The FBI had arrived. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man who introduced himself as Supervisory Special Agent David Chen, approached Thorne first. They spoke quietly for a moment before Chen turned his attention to the local officers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority was absolute. "My agent was assaulted," Chen said, his voice flat and cold as steel. "I want all body camera footage, all dash cam footage, and all radio traffic from this incident. We will be taking lead on this investigation. Your officer," he said, gesturing with his chin toward Hogan, who seemed to shrink under the gaze, "will be coming with us." The local shift lieutenant, a man who had likely known Hogan for years, simply nodded. There was no argument to be made. A line had been crossed that superseded any departmental loyalty. 2 of Chen's agents approached Hogan. They didn't speak. One of them produced a pair of handcuffs. The metallic click as they locked around Hogan's wrists was the only sound for a moment. He was being arrested by the very system he thought he represented. His own colleagues, including Sergeant Rostova, stood by and watched, their faces a mixture of shock and grim resignation. They were witnessing the spectacular end of a career, a self-immolation brought on by ego and a taser. Type yes if you think every officer's body camera should upload to a secure, uneditable server the moment it's turned off. The evidence was now the most important thing. FBI technical agents arrived and began the meticulous process of recovering the digital truth. They downloaded the footage from Hogan's camera, from Rostova's, from both patrol car dashboards, and from Thorne's charger. Each file was copied, logged, and sealed under a strict chain of custody. The truth could not be erased. It could not be edited. It was now preserved on federal servers, ready to be played in a federal courtroom. Dale Hogan had built his career on his version of the truth. Now, for the first time, he was about to be confronted by the real thing in crystal clear high definition. The investigation that followed was not just an inquiry into a single assault. It was a forensic autopsy of a failed system. With Dale Hogan in federal custody, Supervisory Special Agent Chen assigned a team of 3 agents from the FBI's Public Corruption and Civil Rights Squad to peel back every layer of Hogan's career. They weren't just looking for evidence to convict him for the assault on Thorne. They were looking for a pattern. They found one almost immediately, and it was uglier than they had imagined. The team started with the official complaints. In his 6 years on the force, Officer Hogan had accumulated 19 citizen complaints. For a department of its size, in a county this quiet, the number was astronomical. A deeper dive revealed the nature of the complaints. 12 were for excessive force during arrests, 4 were for illegal searches, and 3 were for verbal abuse and intimidation. The consistency was chilling. Citizens described a man who was quick to anger, who saw any questioning of his authority as a personal attack, and who consistently escalated minor encounters into physical confrontations. The most damning part? Of those 19 complaints, 19 had been dismissed. The official findings were always the same: unsubstantiated, exonerated, or use of force consistent with department policy. Not a single complaint had ever resulted in disciplinary action. Not a suspension, not a reprimand, not even a mandatory retraining course. The paper trail showed that 3 different supervisors had signed off on these dismissals over the years. One of them, Lieutenant Mark Jennings, was the same shift lieutenant who had arrived on the scene of Thorne's assault. He had personally cleared Hogan of wrongdoing on 7 different occasions. The FBI investigators pulled the case files for every one of those dismissed complaints. They found shoddy, superficial internal affairs reviews. Key witnesses were never interviewed. Contradictory statements in Hogan's reports were ignored. In one case, a man claimed Hogan threw him to the ground for resisting arrest after asking why he'd been pulled over for a broken taillight. The man had a broken wrist. Hogan's report claimed the suspect tripped and fell while attempting to flee. Hogan's body camera footage from the incident, the investigators discovered, had experienced a technical malfunction and was unavailable. It was a classic cover-up, executed with institutional complicity. The pattern wasn't just about violence, it was about pretext. The agents analyzed Hogan's traffic stop data for the previous 2 years. They found he initiated stops for minor equipment violations, window tint, improperly displayed license plates, single broken taillights, at a rate 3 times higher than the department average. A demographic breakdown revealed that 78% of these stops involved minority drivers. These pretextual stops frequently led to Hogan claiming he smelled marijuana or saw furtive movements, justifications he used to conduct warrantless searches of vehicles. The searches almost never yielded contraband. They were fishing expeditions, exercises in humiliation and dominance, all under the guise of proactive policing. The investigators interviewed several of the citizens who had filed complaints. Their stories were eerily similar to Agent Thorne's experience, minus the FBI credentials to save them. A mechanic who was pulled over and berated for having a small air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror, which Hogan deemed an obstruction of view. A young woman who was ordered out of her car and made to wait on the curb for 30 minutes while Hogan searched it, only to find nothing. An elderly man who was screamed at for not pulling over fast enough. They all described the same man, an officer drunk on his own power, whose ego was as much a part of his uniform as his badge. When the FBI team presented their findings to the U.S. Attorney, the scope of the case expanded. This wasn't just about Dale Hogan anymore. It was about his enablers. The U.S. Attorney's Office convened a federal grand jury. The indictment handed down wasn't just against Hogan. While Hogan faced charges of assault on a federal officer and deprivation of rights under color of law, Lieutenant Mark Jennings and another supervisor were indicted for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal civil rights violations. They had not just ignored the warnings, they had actively buried them, creating the monster that had finally attacked one of their own. The department's performance evaluations praised Hogan's proactive and aggressive policing style. His high number of stops and arrests were seen as signs of a dedicated officer, not red flags of a constitutional crisis in the making. The system hadn't just failed to stop him, it had actively rewarded him for the very behavior that led to his downfall. What do you think should happen to supervisors who ignore a clear pattern of misconduct? Share your verdict in the comments. The truth was now laid bare. Dale Hogan was not an anomaly. He was a symptom of a diseased culture, a culture of willful ignorance and institutional protection that had allowed a predator to flourish in its ranks. The trial of Officer Dale Hogan was a federal affair, held not in a cozy county courthouse, but in the imposing United States District Court in Baltimore. The air in the courtroom was heavy and formal. Hogan, stripped of his uniform and dressed in an ill-fitting suit, looked smaller, diminished. He sat next to his defense attorney, a man tasked with the impossible job of defending the indefensible. The prosecution, led by an assistant U.S. attorney named Claire Sims, was calm, confident, and armed with the one witness that could not be cross-examined, intimidated, or confused: the digital recording of the event itself. Hogan's defense strategy was built on 3 pillars, and the prosecution was prepared to demolish each one. The first pillar was fear. His attorney argued that Hogan, a lone officer on a desolate road, perceived Marcus Thorne's calm refusal to exit the car as a sign of a hidden threat. He claimed Hogan feared for his life, believing Thorne might be reaching for a weapon inside the vehicle, and that the taser was deployed as a last resort to control a potentially deadly situation. Prosecutor Sims' rebuttal was simple and devastating. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to play Exhibit A, the body camera footage from the defendant's own uniform. She nodded to a technician, and the large screen in the courtroom flickered to life. The jury saw the scene from Hogan's perspective. They saw Marcus Thorne, hands in plain sight at 10 and 2. They heard his calm, professional tone as he identified himself and explained the vehicle's status. They saw him announce his every move. They saw zero threatening gestures, zero furtive movements, zero indication of any danger whatsoever. The jury didn't see an officer in fear. They saw an agent in complete control being confronted by an officer losing his. The fear claim evaporated under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The second pillar of the defense was confusion. The attorney argued that Hogan, under the stress of the moment, didn't believe Thorne's claim of being a federal agent. He painted it as a common lie officers hear, suggesting Hogan was justified in his skepticism and that Thorne had failed to properly and convincingly identify himself. Sims countered this by playing the audio track from the recording, isolated and amplified through the courtroom speakers. The jury heard Thorne's voice, clear and unambiguous. Officer, I am a federal law enforcement officer. My credentials are in my right pocket. I am Special Agent Marcus Thorne, FBI, Baltimore Field Office. All you have to do is make one call to dispatch. Sims had the court reporter read back the transcript. Thorne had announced his identity and offered proof 4 separate times before the assault. The defense's suggestion that Hogan was confused or that Thorne was unconvincing was exposed as a patent absurdity. The third and final pillar was the split-second decision defense. The attorney argued that police officers are forced to make life-or-death decisions in fractions of a second, and that Hogan's actions should be judged within that chaotic context, not with the clear benefit of hindsight. Sims dismantled this with cold, methodical precision. She called an expert witness, a former police chief and use-of-force instructor. The expert testified that not only was the initial deployment of the taser on a seated, non-threatening individual a violation of every accepted policing standard in the nation, but the intent was clear. He pointed out Hogan's failure to give the mandatory verbal warning before deployment. He highlighted Hogan's theatrical shout of, "Suspect is non-compliant," after the assault, labeling it a clear and conscious effort to fabricate a justification for the camera. This wasn't a split-second decision made under pressure. It was a deliberate choice, an act of punishment for perceived disrespect. The stress claim collapsed. The final witness for the prosecution was Special Agent Marcus Thorne himself. He walked to the stand with a calm dignity. He didn't speak with anger or seek vengeance. He simply recounted the facts, his voice the same steady, professional tone the jury had heard on the recording. He explained the law regarding federal vehicles, his training in constitutional policing, and his attempts to de-escalate the situation. He was the living embodiment of the professionalism Dale Hogan had assaulted. His testimony, combined with the irrefutable video evidence, sealed Hogan's fate. The defense attorney's closing argument was weak, a rehash of the already discredited claims of fear and confusion. Prosecutor Sims's closing was a quiet, powerful indictment. She played the video one last time, freezing on the image of Dale Hogan's face, contorted in a sneer of triumph as he held the taser. "This is not the face of fear," she told the jury. "This is not the face of confusion. This is the face of a man who believes his badge gives him the right to be judge, jury, and punisher on the side of a highway. Today, you, the jury, will tell him he is wrong." The jury filed out. They returned in 45 minutes. Guilty. On all counts. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreperson read the verdict. On the charge of assault on a federal officer, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A quiet exhale swept through the room. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Dale Hogan didn't react. He stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, his face a pale, emotionless mask. The reality of his situation had finally settled in, a weight so immense it seemed to crush all feeling out of him. The swiftness of the verdict was a statement in itself. 45 minutes was not the mark of a jury that had struggled with doubt. It was the mark of a jury that had been presented with an open and shut case of criminal abuse. 2 weeks later, the same courtroom was convened for sentencing. Marcus Thorne was present, sitting in the front row, not as a witness, but as an observer. He was there to see the system he had dedicated his life to work to its final conclusion. Hogan's attorney pleaded for leniency, citing his years of service and the lack of a prior criminal record. He painted Hogan as a good officer who had one very bad day. Prosecutor Sims stood and countered that this was not about one bad day. Citing the FBI's investigation, she detailed the 19 prior complaints, the pattern of escalation, the history of dismissed allegations. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "this was not one bad day. This was the day Dale Hogan's pattern of misconduct finally targeted a man who was part of a system powerful enough to hold him accountable. The question is not why he did this to Agent Thorne. The question is, how many others, who didn't have a badge and credentials, suffered the same abuse without recourse?" Then U.S. District Judge Eleanor Vance, a woman known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense demeanor, spoke. She removed her glasses and looked directly at Dale Hogan. "Mr. Hogan, for 6 years you wore a uniform and carried a badge that represented the trust of the people of your county. It was a symbol of protection, of law, of order. You twisted that symbol into a license for your own ego. You were not a guardian, you were a bully." Her voice was calm but cut like a razor. "You didn't assault Agent Thorne because you were afraid. You assaulted him because he refused to be afraid of you. He calmly and professionally challenged your illegal authority, and for that offense, you subjected him to 50,000 volts of electricity. You did so under the color of law, the most profound betrayal of public trust an officer can commit. The evidence for this is not just compelling, it is absolute. Your own camera recorded your crime. Your own words damned you." Judge Vance paused, letting the weight of her words fill the room. The justice system is not perfect, but when it is presented with a case this clear, it has a duty to act decisively, not just to punish the offender, but to send a message to all who wear the badge. You are not above the law. You are its most visible servant. She put her glasses back on and delivered the sentence. "It is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons for a term of 144 months, 12 years. There will be no possibility of parole." A gasp came from the back of the courtroom where Hogan's family sat. Hogan himself finally broke, slumping forward in his chair as if the judge's words had been a physical blow. 12 years, a decade of his life, gone. The sentence also came with a lifetime ban on owning a firearm and the permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. His career was over. His life as he knew it was over. But the consequences were only just beginning to ripple outward. The guilty verdicts against his 2 supervisors for obstruction of justice followed a month later. They received lighter sentences, 18 and 24 months respectively, but they were convicted felons, their careers and reputations destroyed for protecting a rogue cop. The verdicts sent a shockwave through their entire department. The county initiated a painful and public process of internal cleansing. An outside agency was brought in to audit every single one of Hogan's past cases and every complaint he'd ever received. The findings were so damning that the police chief was forced to resign. 24 other cases Hogan had been involved in were flagged for review, potentially jeopardizing prior convictions. The single act of violence on that sunny Maryland road had exposed a deep rot within the department, and the price of that exposure was now being paid not just by Hogan, but by the entire institution that had enabled him. The criminal conviction was a matter of individual justice. The civil lawsuit that followed was about systemic change. 3 months after Hogan was sentenced, Marcus Thorne, represented by a top civil rights law firm, filed a lawsuit not just against Dale Hogan personally, but against the county, the police department, the disgraced former chief, and the 2 convicted supervisors. The lawsuit wasn't primarily about money. It was about forcing the department to reform in a way that would be permanent and binding. The county's lawyers knew they stood no chance in a trial. The evidence was overwhelming, and a jury award could be financially catastrophic. They immediately entered into settlement negotiations. The final agreement was staggering, an $8 million settlement paid to Agent Thorne. But Thorne had instructed his lawyers that the money was secondary. The real teeth of the settlement were in the attached consent decree, a court-enforced agreement that mandated sweeping, non-negotiable reforms. The consent decree read like a wish list for police accountability advocates. It mandated the implementation of a state-of-the-art early warning system to automatically flag officers who, like Hogan, accumulated a high number of use-of-force incidents or citizen complaints. It required a complete overhaul of the department's use-of-force policy, explicitly banning the use of tasers on compliant or passively resisting individuals. A new independent civilian oversight board was created, given full subpoena power to investigate misconduct allegations, ensuring complaints would never again be buried by a blue wall of silence. Most critically, it mandated that every officer wear a body camera, and that any officer found to have intentionally deactivated their camera during an interaction with a citizen would be subject to immediate termination. For the next 5 years, the department would be subject to the oversight of a federal monitor to ensure every single term of the decree was met. The implementation was painful for the department. 14 officers, including several who were close friends of Hogan and shared his aggressive policing philosophy, were fired or resigned during the first year of the reforms. The culture of impunity was being systematically dismantled. The department that emerged from the crucible of this scandal was, by necessity, more transparent, more cautious, and more accountable. The case of Thorne versus Hogan became a textbook example, taught in law schools and police academies across the country, a cautionary tale of how institutional rot can lead to spectacular collapse. Marcus Thorne returned to active duty at the FBI after 6 months of physical and psychological recovery. The nerve damage from the tasing left him with a slight tremor in his left hand, a permanent physical reminder of that day. He was promoted to a supervisory role and, at his own request, was assigned to the training division at Quantico. He now leads courses on constitutional policing for new FBI recruits and local law enforcement executives from around the country. He uses the video of his own assault as a central part of his training curriculum. He forces these future leaders to watch the entire, excruciating event. He makes them see what happens when ego replaces oath, when power corrupts procedure. His black Dodge Charger, its windows still tinted to the exact same degree, is sometimes parked outside the training facility, a silent, tangible monument to the day a routine stop nearly turned deadly. He had transformed his personal trauma into a shield for countless others. At its core, Officer Dale Hogan's catastrophic decision was born from a potent and toxic cocktail of personal insecurity and institutional arrogance. Psychologically, Hogan likely suffered from a form of professional narcissism, where his sense of self-worth was inextricably tied to the absolute authority of his badge. When Agent Thorne, with his calm professionalism and knowledge of the law, failed to provide the deference Hogan's ego demanded, it was perceived not as a legal disagreement, but as a profound personal invalidation. This triggered a narcissistic injury, leading to a rage that bypassed all training and reason. He wasn't enforcing the law, he was desperately reasserting a fragile sense of dominance. The system he worked in, which had consistently rewarded his aggression and dismissed all complaints against him, had taught him that this behavior was not only acceptable, but effective. He had no reason to believe this time would be any different. Could the outcome have been mitigated? If Thorne, hypothetically, had immediately complied and stepped out of the car, the initial confrontation would have ended. However, that would have validated an illegal order and likely subjected him to further humiliation, a search, a pointless detention. It would have meant sacrificing a fundamental principle for the sake of avoiding conflict with a bully. For a man who teaches constitutional law, this was an unacceptable compromise. Perhaps a better path, though it's Monday morning quarterbacking, might have been to immediately state, "Officer, for your safety and mine, I am now activating my own audio recorder. Please be advised, this entire interaction is being documented for a federal record." This might have introduced a moment of pause, a flicker of self-preservation in Hogan's mind. But given Hogan's mindset, any action other than total submission was likely to be met with escalation. The ultimate lesson here is twofold. First, for the citizen, it underscores the terrifying vulnerability one faces during a traffic stop, but also the immense power of documentation. The cameras were Thorne's salvation. They were the only witnesses that could not be intimidated. They spoke a truth that was louder than a perjured police report. Second, and more critically, it's a lesson for institutions. The system failed 19 times before it was forced to work once. 19 complaints were 19 chances to retrain, discipline, or terminate an officer who was a ticking time bomb. The true crime wasn't just the assault. It was the years of willful blindness by supervisors who chose loyalty to a fellow officer over their duty to the public. Accountability is not a destination. It is a process, and it begins long before a felony is caught on tape. It begins with the first complaint that is taken seriously. This story forces us to ask, how many Dale Hogans are still on the street, their complaints filed away in a locked cabinet? And what happens when their next stop involves someone who doesn't have the training, the resources, and the authority of the FBI to back them up? If this story made you believe in the power of accountability, please hit that like button. If you believe every single citizen complaint deserves a transparent and thorough investigation, share this story. What do you believe is the single most important reform a police department can make to prevent this from happening again? Leave your answer in the comments below.